So hello everybody and welcome back to the latest episode of the Beyond Waste podcasts. My name is Richard Hudson and I'm the Technical Manager in the Policy Innovation and Technical team here at CIWM. The subject of today's topic is why is it so hard to sustain a plastics recycling business? And this is quite timely. Earlier on this week there was a white paper issued by EcoSurety and Recoup, and one of the key headline findings from that particular white paper was that without certain interventions there is a risk that by 2030 we may not have a UK plastics reprocessing sector for packaging waste. Now you may say this is crazy, this is absolute madness. You know, there's never been a time when we need plastics recycling capacity in the UK. All of the ducks are lined up. We've got legislation coming in. We've extended producer responsibility. We've got the simpler recycling collections, deposit return schemes. We're going to be collecting more. So, you know, surely there's never been a better time to be a plastics reprocessor. But that's not really backed up by the statistics. We've seen something like 21 reprocessors closed down in the UK over the last 2 years. We've lost something like 250,000 tonnes of capacity, and it's not just in the UK either. The pattern is repeated across Europe. So what is going on? You know, what's going on out there at the moment? So to help try and answer some of these questions and have some discussion around some of the issues that face, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to the podcast Adam Herriott. Now, Adam is a senior specialist at RAP. He's been instrumental on the UK Plastics Pact, a member of the OPL Advisory Board. So, Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
It's an absolute pleasure. Adam, would you like to just say, one or two words about your role at RAP and what you do and some of your experiences?
Yeah, so I've been at RAP for, it's coming up for 7 years now. So I joined in March 2019. So I was at RAP just under a year when the pandemic hit. And in that time, obviously, how RAP operate and work and what we do has changed quite significantly. We've grown from sort of what most people know us from being sort of Banbury based, having offices in Belfast and Cardiff as well, to now having offices in Australia, in the US, in Europe. So we're slowly taking over the world, one region at a time. But so for me, so I work predominantly at the moment within what we call the plastics team on the UK Plastics Pact. And obviously that's been running since 2018. It's coming to an end the end of March. So we're coming right to the end now, and we're transitioning from something that's focusing very much on plastics packaging to all packaging, very much aligned with where sort of policy legislation is going, with the likes of simple recycling, EPR, trying to nitpick all the different challenges. But I think it's fair to say that plastics will still very much be a priority work stream for us, priority waste stream for us. So I work predominantly in that team, but I've got fingers in lots of pies across RAP. So I also work very closely with the local authority team, who obviously support local authorities in this interesting time of simple recycling implementation. But I also work with policy insights. I also work with the Recycle Now brand, obviously looking at behaviour change and sort of getting communications out there to the general public about trying to myth bust some of the stuff around recycling and plastics and what you can and can't recycle to.
You mentioned interesting times there. I believe that's a Chinese curse, isn't it? May you live in interesting times, I think, and it probably sums up the state of things at the moment, as does the fact that, unbelievably, a couple of weeks' time, it'll be 5 years, won't it, since the pandemic lockdown?
It's gone very, very quick in a very, very different world. It still somehow seems like yesterday, doesn't it? It's
It certainly does. And let's face it, things like we're doing today, weren't so commonplace 5 years ago. But that's one of the changes, and I think the whole industry has transitioned, and the plastics processing industry has transitioned as well. So, I mean, to launch straight in there, the fact is that UK plastics reprocessors are struggling at the moment. So, Why is that, Adam? What do you think are the main reasons behind that?
So I think there's, I mean, it is an interesting time, to put it very, very mildly, isn't it, really, especially for the plastics reprocessors. But I think, as you mentioned, it's not just the UK either. If you look across Europe, it's about 10% of plastics recycling capacity is also closed down in the last year or so. So it's very much a Europe-wide, UK-wide thing, and arguably probably spread across the world as well. So I think there's a whole host of different reasons potentially why it's become so difficult for reprocessors. I think if you look at say like energy costs, for example, in the UK we've got some of the highest energy costs in the world, particularly and especially in Europe. And when you try and compete with other markets in Eastern Europe or further afield, where obviously they've got lower energy costs, they've got lower labour costs, they can reprocess or manufacture polymers and plastics significantly cheaper. And obviously plastics is a global commodity. We're not bound by our own borders in this. So when it comes to sort of export import material, it's going across there. So we're trying to compete on a playing field that just isn't level for our domestic recyclers. I think for me that's one of the key things.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned the energy costs as well, and of course, it takes a lot of energy to melt plastics, which obviously is a fundamental part of the reprocessing. But I think you've also got the high labour costs in the UK as well that we have to compete against, and of course, because we haven't got it's probably fair to say, there is still some residual plastics manufacturing in the UK, but we are very reliant on imports from overseas. And I see some of the low prices for some of the the Chinese sourced and some of the Middle East sourced polymers, and it's incredibly cheap, isn't it? It's you do wonder sometimes whether or not that it is is the dumping going on? Should we be applying tariffs to some of these inputs? But of course, then that is then also penalising ourselves on that, because it's almost like Donald Trump type tariff. You put the tariff on something, somebody's going to pay for it somewhere. So it is very difficult, I guess, as a plastics reprocessor, when it's very difficult for you to actually get your material to market for less than people can buy virgin feedstock, and that's the reality of the situation, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, obviously we've got plastics packaging tax that's been in effect since 2021. So obviously that's been not 4 years ago. We talked about the pandemic being 5 years ago. The tax came in 4 years ago, and obviously that's only going up each year with CPI, isn't it? So in April this year is £128 and something pence. And you think effectively it's a voluntary tax, isn't it? It's a voluntary thing to do. So when you think virgin is so much cheaper than recycled content in pretty much every aspect for every polymer we're using within packaging, from an economic standpoint, you're going to pick virgin and just pay the tax. It will still come out cheaper than using recycled content, won't it? So it's trying to find that balance of what you want to do as say, if you're a brand retailer putting material onto the market and wanting to show your green credentials, as it were, and do the right thing and have recycled content, but also trying to find a balance in terms of like making sure packaging is cheap enough to use, you've got your margins, all those sorts of things. And as a recycler, when you're trying to compete with reprocessors further afield who can produce recycled content or supposed recycled content potentially for so much cheaper, what can you do? Because you can't just sell it for so much less and match the price from abroad, because you're just going to go out of business, as many unfortunately have done so far. So we need to try and find a way to level that playing field to make it attractive for brands, retailers, those who are using the material to one, use recycled content in the first place, but also use it from domestic sources where it's appropriate. But I think it's an interest. I was having a conversation yesterday at an event, and we were talking about, everyone talks about this need for keeping domestic recyclate and using domestic recyclate or actually sending it abroad as long as it's traceable and is going to go to legitimate recycling processes. Is that a bad thing? Because like we talk about, say, other materials like cardboard going back to the Far East, no one bats an eyelid at that, because people understand that kind of makes sense, because you're shipping over the TVs or whatever it might be in cardboard boxes. It makes sense to send the card back over there to be recycled and made into new packaging there. So why should that be any different for plastics or any other material? So it's an interesting sort of dynamic and conversations I've been having of late with lots of people around this.
I guess with plastics, and I totally take your point about the sending materials back to the point that they're actually needed for manufacture. But we've got a UK plastics processing sector that's using something just under about 4 million tons of plastic material per year. So there is demand, I think, from the UK markets. But it's an interesting point. I mean, I cut my teeth back in the sort of mid to late 80s working in plastics injection molding and extrusion, and it was my job to keep the machines running. I was changing the tools and everything else. And when my foreman used to say, Richard, can you use recycled content in this particular production run, your heart used to sink, because you wanted virgin. I know things have changed, technology's moved on, but the point is, you've got production targets, you've got budgets to work within. Virgin material generally doesn't give you any problems, whereas you introduce the recycled content, and all of a sudden your parameters have to be tweaked a little bit. Your scrap rate goes up, and you're also paying more for that material. So it's a massive challenge, I think. And is this where really this is where, and you mentioned the plastics packaging tax. I think that's an interesting one, because we've got a situation there where that's probably in the 4 years that it's been in effect in the UK, it's probably raised something like, I don't know, it must be about £1 billion worth of revenue for the Treasury. So in many ways, is it in their interest to try and encourage people to to actually use more recycled content? When it first came in, it was very much, I think, postulated that it was there to drive demand in recycled. It was there to send signals to the market, which I think it did. When you look at the amount of investment in new facilities that actually followed the announcement that we were going to go ahead with the plastics packaging tax, there was a lot of new capacity went in there. But now we seem to have a little bit of, it's gone a little bit static, I think is what we're fair to say. Producers are taking the view, well, actually, what, I'll pay that tax because it's cheaper than me trying to source materials. And I'm wondering whether, the plastics packaging tax, are the things that we can suggest that we can do that would try and encourage the use of more recycled content and actually help our recyclers along.
Yeah, I think you've come across a really good point there. I think the intended purpose obviously of the tax was to drive recycled content in there, and also obviously make a bit of money for the Treasury, arguably, as well. But I think what it maybe unintentionally has done is put a ceiling on recycled content for a lot of packaging formats. So you think a PET bottle, it's you can get 100% recycled content in the PET part of the bottle relatively easily. I'm not a manufacturer, so I'm not going to pretend I know all the challenges that come around it. But you can get 100% recycled content in that bottle. However, putting that 30% sort of recycled content sort of cap, I guess you could call it, for the tax. A lot of those people we found within the UK Plastics Pact, when we were looking at how much recycled content people were putting in things. Say you might have, say, for a PET tray, food tray, you might have had, say, 60% recycled content or 80% recycled content, whatever it might have been. Tax came along, like, well, actually, we can avoid paying the tax by just putting 30% recycled content in. So we can actually drop our recycled content, save money by using virgin for a bit, but still avoiding the tax. So there's those sorts of things that happen as well. And I think I mentioned earlier on, it's effectively a voluntary tax, isn't it? So you either
Absolutely, yeah.
put the recycled content in, or you can pay the tax and still almost be ahead of the game economically when it comes to cost versus virgin versus recycled content. But then you look across the channel into Europe with PPWR coming in later on this year, and then they've got things like targets like minimum recycled content plastics of 25%. Well, where do you think they're going to try and get some good recycled material from? Especially when you think next October we've got DRS is due to be implemented, so we're going to have a lot of very high quality, very good, clear PET that is going to be very valuable. But Europe arguably is going to have a stronger demand for that material. And obviously, in an ideal world, and I know you speak to the bottle manufacturers and those who are the big brands who are placing material into the market, they would love that material to stay in the UK, and they can use have that communications of like, this bottle was made from 100% sourced recycled content from UK PET DRS material. But if Europe has an obligation to put a minimum recycled content in there, they're more likely to be willing to pay a higher premium for that than, say, a UK recycler might be able to, potentially. So there's lots of these different things that we need to try and work out how they're going to work, because, as I say, it is an interesting, exciting time when it comes for our sector in terms of all the policy reforms that are being implemented with simple recycling, DRS, ETS, EPR, all the other acronyms that we give, all the policies that we have as well. But actually, we're trying to implement a lot around a similar time. So how they're all going to work together, I don't think anyone necessarily knows. And anyone who does say that they can gaze into their crystal ball and know what the impact they're all going to have on each other working at the same time, I suggest they also play the lottery. But it's like how it's all going to play out, I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? So, I think that you're right in terms of it's helped going back to your original point, that the plastics packaging tax, it certainly has driven demand to an extent. But I think you're right as well, it's kind of made things a little static. And there's been some great reports that have been done over the last few years since the implementation of the tax by likes of Recoup, Veolia have done some good ones as well. Using, I say Veolia one's a great one because they use some of RAP's modelling, so definitely not biased there at all. But looking at actually like what could we, if we say put an escalator on the tax, or we heightened the threshold from 30% to 40% or 50%, all those different things, what might the impact be there? Would that support recycling infrastructure in the UK? Or if we were to say it's a mandatory recycled content of X%, how much capacity would we then need for the different sorting facilities or polymer recycling facilities and things like that? So there's been some really interesting sort of thought pieces out there too as well. As we mentioned, obviously the Recoup and Eco-Surety thought piece on the state of reprocessing in the UK as well.
Well, they had, one of the other, I think, interesting facts that came out of the report, again, one of their key highlights is they said that the UK's maximum capacity is 40% of the capacity needed to reprocess all the plastic packaging placed on the UK market if we chose to do so. And I think, that almost flags up to me, and it was a point that you alluded to as well, that, it's very difficult to look at any of this in isolation. There are so many interrelated factors, not only in the UK, but then, as you rightly say, this is a global trade as well. And I'm wondering whether, you look at the plastics packaging tax, what could you do? Could you introduce fee modulation, for instance? So, rather than have this almost 30% figure where what's the incentive to really go any further above 30%? Maybe you have a situation where you actually start from 0% up to 100%. If you're using 100% recycled, you're not going to pay any tax at all. If you have 0% recycled, then you're going to pay a basic minimum. And I think that's something that the Spanish plastics packaging tax introduces, that whole concept, which is interesting. But then you do that and you think, well, okay, that's problem solved. But then, because we're competing for material with our European and global partners, as you say, material will chase the most profitable market. So you end up then maybe pricing ourselves out of the market as well. It is so complex, and I don't profess to know what the best way forward is, other than to intuitively, my gut feeling is that we need to be doing something, and that we probably need to, well, we HMRC probably need to tinker around with the plastics packaging tax, just to try and stimulate the market in different ways. It's been 4 years now. It's probably time for a review. They've mentioned about there was a lot of the use of mass balance techniques, for instance, in recycled content. So there is some flexibility there, but it just strikes me that it is in need of a little bit of an overhaul.
I think you're definitely right there potentially. I think obviously last year the result of the recent consultation said they're going to have a consultation on the verification of recycled content. I think that's something that's very welcome from industry, because I think if there's a lot of claims that, if you're importing material from abroad, it's effectively a tick box exercise of, does it have recycled content in? Oh yeah, sure, fine, okay, right, I haven't got to pay the tax. And I mean, I've heard of anecdotes of people sort of looking at material and suppliers from whichever country it might be, saying, oh yes, this food grade film has 50% recycled content minimum, we can do 100% recycled content. And you think, hang on a minute, food grade film with recycled content from a country that doesn't necessarily have a formal waste management sector, where it doesn't necessarily meet the food standards of Europe and the UK. It's like, how does this work? How is this technically possible? But it's because there's no sort of verification part on it at the moment. That makes that playing field that the UK reprocessors are trying to compete on. It's just not a level one at all, because we know that, for example, we go to a recycler up in the Midlands or something, and it's easy to trace and look at exactly what their material is, where it's come from, how much is recycled content, how much might be virgin. Whereas if it's halfway around the world, it is effectively it's the tick box exercise, and it's something that hasn't. I don't think the tax has necessarily grappled with particularly well for our recyclers over here. So I think that the announcement of the consultation about, okay, how can we do the verification of recycled content, is very much a welcome one. And I think from the mass balance perspective, obviously when you look at chemical or non-mechanical recycling, I think that's a whole other kettle of fish. I think, because I think depending on which side of the fence you are, you either love the idea of it or you hate the idea of it. I mean, for me personally, I'm quite excited about the opportunities that chemical and non-mechanical recycling has for the sector, and the use of mass balance. I don't think is a bad thing at all. We use mass balance in pretty much every other sector and industry. We use it every day. Everyone does when it comes to energy, when it comes to other materials and fibre. Why should it be any different to polymers and plastics for packaging? But again, that's something that's still being ironed out, isn't it, in terms of how that mass balance methodology is going to be, because there isn't one. There's a whole host, and how you verify that as well.
It's like the verification techniques. I think one of my personal frustrations is that I genuinely believe it would be very, very easy to introduce a verification system. You have accredited laboratories worldwide that can do this type of stuff. The mechanisms in place. All you need is an actual will to do it. And again, coming back to the Spanish example, I believe it is something that they insist on as part of their scheme. And I think we have to remember as well that it's something like 60% of the recycled plastics that have been used in the UK are actually coming from overseas. So it's a massive distortion, potentially distortion of the market, and it does impact upon the UK recyclers. And if we had to look for quick wins, that to me is almost a no-brainer. Why are we still sat here talking about it, where the industry wants it. Everybody seems to want it. It could be done. Okay, there's going to be a cost attached, but there's a cost attached, I think, to everything. But really that, when we look for things that can make an impact very, very quickly, to me that is almost a no-brainer. Let's just get on and do it. There's nothing stopping it. But there we go.
So it's fair. You hear that a lot, don't you? It's like, why can't we just get on and do it? We're all a bit susceptible to it, aren't we, of things turning into a talking shop. Everyone's got great ideas, but the actual doing it's always slightly more complex than one might imagine when you start talking about them. But I'm fully behind you with that one. I'd rather get the action underway, definitely.
No, definitely. And I think it would certainly have the backing, I think, of most of the the industry representative groups and everything else, because they see it as a major problem. I mean, the other thing that sort of brings us on to, we've mentioned about potentially unfair competition with overseas reprocessors, and it brings us then onto the subject of waste exports. Always a very, very contentious subject, and for packaging particularly, although the ratios have flipped in recent years, so in the early days of the PRN schemes, most of the PRNs were coming from export, whereas now, I think 2 or 3 years ago, it actually flipped and was slightly more UK reprocessing than export, but we're still something like 500,000 tonnes, isn't it? Something like that, is PRN. So, should we be looking at banning or restricting export of plastic waste? Do you think there's any mileage in that?
It's a difficult one. I think, as I mentioned, obviously, plastics and other material streams as well. It is a global commodity. Like we talk about exporting waste and things, but as CIWM, we all know that there's no such thing as waste, right? It's they're very much valuable resources.
Resource in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Exactly. So I think it's, for me, I think as long if it's being sent somewhere where it's traceable, it's a legitimate operation, it's being reprocessed, it isn't it isn't being exported for someone to fortunately try and claim PRNs, or for someone to then burn at the side of the road somewhere or anything like that. I think it should be fine, right? There shouldn't be any problem with that. Much like any other commodity that you might trade globally. I think in an ideal world, yes, particularly with the geopolitical landscape that we're currently living in, we have to start looking more around self-sufficiency and things like that, and resilience of resources, certainly. But I think in terms of export bans, I mean, everyone has their opinion on this, and again, it's one of those ones that people often have quite strong opinions on, particularly around plastics. But I think very much like, if it's legitimate trade and it's going to somewhere it's going to be, it is getting reprocessed and it's fully traceable, I don't think that's necessarily a big issue. I think I've heard lots of different things that mooted in the past about, when we're exporting, say, plastics, for example, we should only export maybe finished pellet. So it's already reached end of waste, as it were, and it is purely a raw material effectively at that point for manufacturing. I actually quite like that as an idea, and it would help stimulate, eventually help stimulate and support UK reprocessors as well. But I think I'm very much of the opinion of, it's at the moment, particularly at the moment when we haven't got the capacity to deal with all of our waste, all of our plastics once it's collected, if it's collected. How can you justify an export ban, for example? What are we going to do with that material? Because we don't want to lose that material by sending it to energy from waste and burning it. We want to be able to keep that in the economy for as long as possible. So we don't want to just stockpile it somewhere, because then there's a whole host of other issues that will come with stockpiling a very flammable material. So I think, unless we're able to show and demonstrate that we can sustainably, not just from an environmental perspective, but from an economic perspective, we can sustainably deal with the material in the UK, I don't think we can ban exports necessarily. Particularly if we want to make sure that we keep a material within the economy for as long as possible, and we're minimising virgin usage and virgin production.
I would agree, and it was an interesting point you made about, should we be maybe looking at restricting exports to finished pellets? I mean, effectively, that's what China did, with their series of restrictions that ultimately led into a ban. And it's no surprise that Turkey became such a massive market for a lot of the waste coming out of the UK and also Europe, because effectively that's what the Turkish reprocessors are doing. They're converting a lot of that material into a pellet to then supply into the Chinese market. But the point is they're getting the value of that. This is an important, potentially valuable commodity that we say, well, should we be banning it? Well, that almost shouldn't be an issue, because it should be so valuable that you'd be crazy to export it, because you try and valorize it in the UK. I mean, looking at some of the reports that have been out recently. Again, I refer back to the Eco-Surety Recoup report. There was some work done by the British Plastics Federation a few years ago. They're saying that this additional capacity that we need in the UK to be able to manage all of our own plastic waste. There's value attached to that. The figures that they came up with is that we've got potentially £1 billion worth of benefit there. We've got something like 1,500 new jobs. We've got 1,500 additional jobs in the the wider supply chain. This is potentially an absolutely, well, I won't say massive. It's a problem that whereas nowadays £1 billion doesn't actually sound a lot, but let's put that into context. That is 1,000 million pounds.
Yeah.
That is a significant amount of money that for minimum use of public funds.
It's something I think
surely.
I think it's something that's often glossed over is the value that's lost to the UK economy by exporting lots of material. I think, as I mentioned, if you said at the start of this, then if we can convert this plastic waste, as it were, into something like pellets, so obviously we're giving it a value, we're giving it a high value. That's something that they say. If you then do export it to somewhere else to be manufactured into new packaging or new products, whatever it might be, if it's got that high value and people are paying lots of money for it, they're not going to dump it on the side of a road. It's not going to end up in a field somewhere or burnt in the field. It will get recycled because the value is far too high for it to do that. There's a reason you don't tend to hear about bales of aluminium being left on a roadside, do you? It's a very valuable material. So if we can do that for plastics and make sure that plastics gets that value, which I think is obviously very difficult to do, but I think it's something we can do, and we can increase the value of it in the UK. And I think that would be really key. But that doesn't start with the recyclers. It doesn't necessarily start with policy. That starts with design, right? Mm-hmm. If we design the materials and the packaging with end of life in mind, and trying to keep the value and make it easier to be captured and be recycled, or if it's or be reused, then that's going to be so much better for us as the economy, for the environment, for everything. And it's going to minimise potential system fraud, minimise potential waste crime as well, and people trying to find the loopholes in the system and all that sort of stuff, which, although they're a minority, does unfortunately happen, as we know. Then it'd be much better for us. And I think that's where brands, retailers, design companies have that responsibility as well. I'm not going to say have a role. They have a responsibility, particularly we've got things like packaging EPR being implemented. They start paying their bills for packaging EPR, and money's going out to local authorities. That puts the onus on them to make sure that actually, if you design your packaging with this end of life in mind, so when it comes to plastics, using monomaterials, minimise things like small formats, minimise multi-material laminates and foil laminates and complex things and all those sorts of stuff, and make it easy to recycle, especially now we've got simple recycling being implemented in a few weeks' time for local authorities in England, then yes, that helps that help us be able to try and keep the value within the material, helps the recyclers in the UK as well, because they're not having to do extra processes to try and remove difficult materials or remove contamination or not make them unsure what their feedstock's actually going to be in the composition of that feedstock. Then, yeah, that'll help them keep the value and be able to sort of compete with those further afield as well.
It does. It makes the point that, I think there isn't a single solution to this problem. It comes from a number of things happening in parallel, and certainly I am personally a big fan of eco-modulation and modulating fees, because I think it is, you actually put a monetary value and you incentivize people to do the right thing design wise, because they have an incentive to do that. What a really, really powerful tool. And I know it's not without its problems, and we have a very, very complex system. But I would personally stick my neck on the block and go out there and say that we should probably abolish the plastics packaging tax, but instead bring that mechanism into extended producer responsibility. Because to me, they're one and the same thing. It's almost a form of eco modulation, and people are already paying. Well, producers are already paying twice, so why not just
streamline it somewhat?
Streamline it, yeah, absolutely. Make it a little bit simpler. But there we go. I mean,
it's an interesting concept, I think, actually, because it's not necessarily a new concept. I mean, I've been involved in many conversations with brands, obviously through the UK Plastics Pact and moving into Packaging Pact. And then with brands trying to understand where their packaging portfolios and particular SKUs might fit in on the RAM, and is it a green, a amber, a red? How do they move it into one to the other, or how might the RAM develop over the next 6 months to year, and so on and so forth, and then especially as the eco modulation comes in, and they're already in back of their minds kind of assuming that recycled content is already part of the eco modulation, not realizing actually no, that's actually a separate thing.
Yeah.
And you can't, and I guess obviously this is a question for government, I guess, really, but then they're probably unlikely to have, say, the plastics packaging tax and then include recycled content in eco modulation, because then businesses will be paying twice and they'll be duplicating sort of thing. So it'll be an interesting conversation between DEFRA Pack UK and Treasury about how they might want to do that. Because, and I think I can imagine where recyclers might want it to go, because where the money might end up filtering to.
Yeah.
In theory.
To be a fly on the wall, but yes, I can imagine walking into Treasury and saying, yeah, that 250 million that you're getting every year, we're going to have that.
Yeah.
I know, we've had many conversations with HMRC about, this hypothecation of tax revenues, trying to actually make the argument that you've got this £250 million coming in every year. Can that not be used to directly support the UK reprocessing sector? And I think whilst probably fair to say they are sympathetic to our arguments, it's not going to happen, because hypothecation is just not something that they would entertain. But yeah, what's the saying? And my cat has just jumped off my lap, and I was going to make the point about there's more than one ways to skin a cat. So there we go. I mean, we're talking about this complicated legislative background that we have, and of course for plastics, arguably it's going to get even more complicated in a few years' time, where the emissions trading scheme and with energy from waste plants and from incinerators are actually brought into that scheme, and that I think is going to bring a really, really strong focus on the use of plastics, because as we all know, plastics are probably one of the, or will be one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gases coming out of energy from waste plants. So there's going to be a very, very high incentive to actually, well, one of two things, I think: either to take them out, i.e., remove them and hopefully go down a recycling type route, or for people to stop using plastics in certain applications altogether. I mean, do you see the world shifting as a result of well, it's not the world, but the UK shifting as a result of that?
I think there certainly is going to be a bit of a shift as a result of ETS, but I don't think it necessarily is just going to be something for plastic packaging, but also textiles. So obviously a lot of textiles are made from polymers, like we've got polyester blends and all this sort of stuff. So I think that's going to be a big thing. And obviously, textiles market has its own particular challenges, much like the plastics market does. I think early signs are, speaking to brands, retailers, early signs are that they're trying to get their head around EPR when it comes to the reasons why they may or may not switch out of one packaging format to another. I think over the last maybe 6 months, I've had one or two, and it's only been one or two very brief conversations or more comments from them about what ETS might mean for their packaging and how the cost coming from ETS that goes to local authorities and how that might filter into EPR, and therefore to the retailer, to the brand, to whoever, how that might impact them. Because obviously, as a business, they want to try and cut down what their bills are going to be. So some are starting to look at what material alternatives are. However, they are also at the same time trying to make sure they understand where the cards are going to fall for EPR in general and the RAM, because they don't want to make a switch from one material into another, be locked into it for a long time, and then actually the RAM methodology change for whatever reason it might be for a particular material, and then the cost actually be significantly more now they've made that change. So I think that, yes, I think ETS is probably in the background for them, but it's very much in the background, rightly or wrongly, possibly wrongly. I think it's a conversation I think will become more and more embedded in conversations moving forward. And that, especially now EPR started, obviously it's getting more traction, it's being embedded more, it's starting to not necessarily settle, but it's people getting used to what's going on. But I think as well it's the whether they move out of say fossil-based plastics and then into like a bio-derived sort of non-modified polymer. So it's kind of, which I believe is kind of out of scope of ETS. So I'm sure someone will correct me and how wrong I am on that.
Standing biogenic, isn't it? So
yeah. So you might get some moves to those in certain applications, perhaps, maybe because of functionality, potentially. So yeah, I think it's very much going to be a watching brief for the next 12 to 18 months. 12 months maybe, because obviously it's 2028 that ETS is due to come into effect, isn't it? So I think people will start paying attention more to that as they need to start gearing up to make potential packaging changes in time.
I think it's going to be interesting that at a time where there is going to be pressure to take plastics out of the waste stream going to energy from waste plants, we're going to have the final strand of simpler recycling coming in 2027, when we're going to start collecting the obviously the plastic films, and that is a very interesting area. And obviously the plastics, the UK Plastics Pact have done some fantastic work, I think, in priming certainly the collections for plastic films. But a lot of people are still saying that what is it, 250,000 tons of plastic films entering the waste stream every year. I think in the early days of it being proposed, chemical recycling was the white knight that was going to ride in and save the day. But I think we're probably behind the curve on that one. What are we going to do with all these plastics films that we're collecting? Is that an opportunity for the sector? Is that an opportunity for the UK reprocessors?
Yeah, unsurprisingly, films and flexibles is a subject very close to my heart, because I've worked a lot on it over the last sort of 7 or so years, being at RAP and working on the plastics pact. And obviously, we've done loads of work with various different partners across the sector. So obviously, we were involved in the Flex Collect work with Suez, Recoup, EcoSurety, Flex Plastic Fund as well, to look at what the modelling of the collections and how much material we're likely to collect, obviously by next year. I think I think I think that the uncomfortable truth, as it were, is we're not going to have the capacity in the UK to deal with all this unless someone makes an incredible announcement tomorrow that they're opening a brand new plant or something that's going to be able to recycle this material. I think
it's insider information, Adam. Are you
if only. I wish. maybe wishful thinking, perhaps. But yeah, it's the uncomfortable truth is we're not going to have the capacity in the UK. I think when we've got, as mentioned, we've got numerous facilities closing already or have closed over the last 12 to 24 months. A lot of them are places like PET recycling plants and HDPE recycling plants. If we can't make the economics stack up for PET and HDPE bottles for recycling, it's going to be a very, very tall ask to make it work for films and flexibles. But I think I don't think that's a reason for us to stop and panic necessarily. But I think that's just maybe more of a rallying cry for us to double down our efforts to try and make some of these things work. And I think that's one of the things that my colleagues would be remiss if I didn't mention. Obviously, when we were launching the UK Packaging Pact in April, is one of the whole goals we've got is around infrastructure for the UK and circular infrastructure, which obviously means yes for plastics and particularly for films going to be a big one and a big challenge. But for other infrastructure like reuse and refill and things like that as well. So I think it's certainly still going to be a massive focus for us about how we can unlock the solutions and understand what those bottlenecks are, why exactly our particular recycling facilities are not getting off the ground, why things aren't scaling. We're fantastic in the UK innovation. Why can't we scale some of this up effectively? What's happening? What is the environment that we need? Is it a legislative one, a policy one? Is it an economic one? Is it simply that it's more attractive elsewhere for people to scale up and they just do the innovation here because we're good at supporting that? But also understand what the material flows are and understand how we can sort of make sure that we're not losing material throughout the system. Which, to say, when we're struggling for capacity, maybe it's not a question we want to answer too quickly. But we want to improve things. So yeah, so next March when we've got, I think talking about Recoup. Obviously, they've just released their household collection survey. And I think they suggest that 1 in 5 local authorities aren't going to be able to collect films and flexibles by end of March next year. I like to think that 4 in 5 are going to be collecting it, so it's a positive story. But we're going to have a significant amount of material that's being collected that we need to find a way of dealing with. And going back to the earlier points we've talked about the export of material and whether or not we should have export restrictions or bans and things like that. It comes down to that point of if we know we're not going to be able to recycle it within our shores because we haven't got the capacity, then we need to be looking at who else can support us in doing that. As long as I said, it's traceable. We know exactly what's happening to it. It's being recycled, and it's not just going off somewhere for more sort of unscrupulous people to do as they wish with.
I mean, it's an interesting point, and you mentioned about the 1 in 5 local authorities don't think that they'll be in a position to collect it. In many ways, that's probably an advantage because that's almost phasing in, isn't it? We're not gonna suddenly be swamping the market with all of this material. So yeah, what's the saying about there's opportunities and threats, and they're often two sides of the same coin, aren't they? Really, and I think there's definitely some potential there for people to crack that problem. And it's interesting because I'm very, very conscious that this has been quite we started off the talk been quite negative about we have this problem. We could lose the UK reprocessing sector by 2030, which is frighteningly close. I can't believe we're only 4 years away from it. But it's not all doom and gloom, though, is it? There are some. I think personally, there are some really good things happening out there. We've got JPLAS, for instance, who have invested significant amounts of money down in South Wales for their was it 100,000 ton? Ultimately, 100,000. I think it's 20,000 ton to start with, but going up to 100,000 ton facility for handling, amongst other things, films, pots, tubs, and trays. We touched upon chemical recycling there. We've got the Renew ELP plant up on Wilton, which is going to be world-class, world-leading use of a new technology. You've got Veolia, their site over in Shrewsbury Battlefield, due to open. That's 80,000 ton site, £70 million worth of investment. There are some bright spots on the horizon. I mean, why is it that some people some companies seem able to make a go of this crazy plastic recycling, whilst others struggle.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. You mentioned obviously we run the risk of this sounding all very, very doom and gloom, and that's not how I like to think of things. When I'm talking about the sector, I'm very excited about everything we're doing as a sector and stuff. So I was trying to think in advance of this, like if I had a quote about this, what would my line be? And I think it's the UK plastics sector, reprocessing sector. It isn't collapsing. We're just trying to restructure it mid-flight. That's how I'm trying to think about it. We're just evolving it, if anything. It's not a pretty process, but it's a process that you can argue probably needs to happen, right? And you mentioned a couple of examples about some of the great things that are doing there. So I know the guys at JPass really well, and I remember when they opened their film sorting plant in Smithwick, around Birmingham area, and they opened it. It was during the pandemic, I think, or during when we had some of the lockdown, one of the many lockdowns we had. And that's about, it's a sorting plant that can deal with around 100,000 tons of material. And it's not like crazy brand new technology type stuff. It's just, solid technology that works, and they might have to put material around the loop a couple of times to get a really high quality, the right quality, and that sort of stuff. But it works, and works really well. And then obviously they've got their own wash plants, they've got their pelletizing plants, and it's for the PE stuff. They've got their own reprocessing as well, and putting into new products. So I think that there are some that are doing it particularly well. You've mentioned a number of others as well. But I think in terms of how come some are arguably more successful than others, I mean, obviously, without knowing everyone's business case, I probably couldn't quite pinpoint the exact answer to that. But I think maybe sometimes it's just situations make you have to reevaluate and have a fresher look at things, maybe about how else can we work, what can we do, what can we identify as an opportunity here. And I think we've talked a lot about, over the last 24 months or whatever it is, we've lost 200,000 tons worth of reprocessing capacity. But that doesn't necessarily tell the whole story in terms of, yes, places have closed, but there have been places that have opened as well. Yes. Obviously, the closures have outstripped the openings a bit, but it isn't like places are just closing and everyone's closing. That doesn't tell the full story, does it? So there are those there are some green shoots, as it were. I think maybe another sort of analogy or metaphor, whatever it is so when you have one of those, forest fires, and then after the forest fires died down, you get the new shoots, the new growth coming through, and it comes back sort of stronger than ever. I like to think that's what's going to happen for us. I think the eco-surety recoup white paper obviously talks about, we've got the potential of losing UK reprocessing by 2030. I think it's important to note that that's a worst case scenario, right? They're not necessarily saying this is definitely going to happen. They're just trying to make sure people understand this is the situation we're currently in if no one takes action. I think we will take action, whether it's, government action, it's industry action, it's, we do things collectively, we do things as collaboratively. I don't think we're going to lose all our capacity. I think, we're very good as a sector of being innovative. You tell me a sector that's more innovative than ours. I don't think I think you'd struggle to find one that's as broad and as innovative as us. So I think we'll be. It might be a long slog and not a pretty one, but I think that we'll come out of this looking better. So I'd say I'm quite positive on this.
On the grounds that I always think you should go out on a high. I think that, Adam, is a fantastic place to end. On that positive note that no, it's not all doom and gloom. We are in a situation where there's a hell of a lot of potential. As mentioned before, a lot of the ducks are in a row, and this. If we're in a situation where we were saying, oh my goodness, we've got no feedstock, we're going to have to close because we've got no feedstock. We're actually in a situation where we can have more feedstock than we've ever had, and I think it is our gift to do something with that. And I think if Leah would agree, it would be probably great to revisit this this particular subject in a podcast, maybe in 12 months' time and in 24 months' time, and hopefully it'll be a little bit more of a positive situation, because I share your optimism as well. I think there is so much potential, but a lot of things does have to happen, and I think it's like anything. You probably need a leg up from government on certain things, but a lot of the destiny is in the hands of the people who are operating the plants at the moment, and there are there are some really good things happening, and I think we should hold on to that. So Adam, it just really leads me to thank you for your time. I think that's been some great insights there. It's been a really interesting conversation. I can't believe where the time has gone. But then again, we could probably do it all over again and probably speak for another hour, without repeating ourselves. It's a fascinating subject, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been great.
Thank you.